I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Brent Orrell, who's a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. Thanks for coming on.
Well, it's just a pleasure. We've had for Twitter, and by Twitter standards, an extended sort of relationship on Twitter. It's been great, and I really enjoy all of your work. And it's an honor to be invited.
My pleasure to have you on. Yeah, it is an interesting thing that, as much as we complain about Twitter being this godforsaken hell site, I think is the usual phrase, that it has its annoyances, but I have met a lot of people there that I might not have interacted with otherwise. So it has its moments. So this comes out of that, because I know you've held various administrative jobs in government. You're a specialist. Your area of specialization is about work and employment, and we're not going to. That's not why you're here today. We're not going to talk about any of that. So to set the context for people, this came from a relatively civil Twitter discussion we had over the role of religion and proving that such a thing is possible. And not just you can have a civil discussion on Twitter, you can also have a civil discussion about religion. And so you had suggested we should continue this in person next time I'm up in DC. And I thought, well, why wait? Why not do this, as a podcast or as a video, and partly to show that set as I say at my kids' school, model good behavior, show that it's possible to hash out these differences in a hopefully an edifying way. The context here for our exchange on this was that there's a claim that theology is the future, because the most interesting new idea thinking is coming from. Now, this person's example were mostly sort of nationalist conservative types, and they used Peter Thiel as an example, which I think is somewhat questionable. But it's the idea that it sparked a discussion about the need for religion as the basis for a free society, and perhaps also the basis for an orderly society. And you were more on the religion is necessary side, and I'm on the religion is not necessary side. So I kind of wanted to just start by having you make the case for us for why, in an increasingly secular age, why we still need religion as a basis for a free and orderly society.
So I guess I would start by saying that it is perfectly possible, and I think we're all very fortunate in this, for both morality and order to be maintained without specific religious commitments by individuals. I don't think that isn't the point. I think that I was talking about so much as I think many people, most people, live in a way in which they tend to express a commitment to adhere to, want their children to live in a way that adheres to kind of fundamental commitments and values that are essential to democratic life. All right. So the way I talk about this is that even if people don't necessarily believe in God, they often live as if they did. And they behave as if they did, and they want their children to behave as if they did. And so that's what I'm talking about in terms of these kind of transcendent commitments, is that even if you don't personally have those transcendent commitments, we often live as if we do, even if we don't have them. And we're very fortunate in that, because a society in which people who don't have religious commitments lived as if they were committed to the idea that there is no transcendent commitment would be pretty hard to live in.
I'm kind of thinking here of the poem. I think it was Chesterton's poem of the Song of the Strange Ascetic, about the guy who lives who's a heathen but lives this. Says, if I were a heathen, I'd conquer my enemies and hang their heads from the battlements. And Higgins is a heathen, and he lives this very, he has this very orderly and kind of dull life.
Yeah. So that's sort of part one. and I don't think that there's a lot of disagreement on that. The question then becomes, the second part of the question is, where do you root in a kind of from an epistemological statement, where do you root those values if you aren't going to use religion? And I think there is an answer to that question, and I think it's actually where people are implicitly, even if they aren't explicitly, which is, you can look at these values and say that they are a product of our evolution as human beings and the evolution of human society, that they are built in sort of a Smithian sense, Adam Smith, theory of moral sentiments kind of way of, that they're built through a social dialogue, and they gain their sort of their strength and their bindingness, if that's a word, I'm sure that's a word, but the way that they bind people evolves out of this kind of social dialogue that doesn't require religion in order to get there. So I would argue that, and then so my last point on this, I think, is that I would argue that even that social dialogue, if you accept that, is still rooted in deeper philosophical traditions in human history. And I would argue, and this is I think the point of contention, that this arises out of this human need for an anchoring in transcendence and not just in a kind of functional morality. Anyway,
so there's a couple words there that you used I thought were interesting. You said it doesn't require a specific religious commitment by individuals, right? So specific and individuals are two qualifications you threw in there. So by specific, I think you might be going something more for what Eisenhower said about how our society depends on a basic religious viewpoint, and I don't care what it is.
And I don't care what it is, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. I think that's right. I mean, from a civic or civil standpoint, that's the most that anybody can ask, is sort of a respect for those values, whether you happen to hold any particular religious belief as a Christian or a Jew or as a Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, or none of the above, that we all kind of agree that we're going to respect these values, even though we might disagree on their origins.
I see your point about how a certain commitment to certain values. I think we should get maybe a little more specific about what those values are, how a commitment to certain values is kind of necessary to keep a society together. And so we could talk about maybe what those values are, like the idea of not resolving every issue by force. The fact that if you have a disagreement with a neighbor, you won't just go whack him over the head. You will defer to some kind of institution or some kind of process to decide to adjudicate the dispute. Or the idea of property, that there are certain things that are legitimately yours and legitimately his, and you have to respect that. And these are things that make a civilized society possible. I think you may have been the one who said, I don't feel the need to count my cutlery after I have guests over for dinner, right? Because the people are honest.
Johnson, I think, right? I think that was Samuel Johnson who said that, but yeah, no, exactly. Like there's an underlying consensus here, and as I said before, we're really fortunate that even if people say, I don't believe in God, that they're still like connected to these values and value these values, and that in my view, it's a lot easier to sustain over time if you can answer the question, says who, right? The era in which we've lived in for the last several hundred years, I think, has been a more or less constant argument over the says who question. Our distant forebears didn't have to answer that question because they lived in societies in which that question was answered for them largely by these religious traditions that they were attached to. And as those religious traditions sort of have lost their hold, we've had to do a lot more work at answering that says who question. and sometimes to really devastating effect. I think that in my reading of the historical record, says who, under certain circumstances, under certain ideological trends, under certain historical stresses, can lead to systems in which somebody rises to the top and says, because I say, right? It could be Stalin, it could be Hitler, it could be Mao, it could be any number of the totalitarian movements of the last 150 years, that because there is no transcendent basis, and implicit in that, transcendent checks on to get to the question of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do in terms of imposing your vision of the good, then you can wind up in really treacherous, dangerous, and deadly terrain. So that's how I put that together. That the transcendence forms both the basis for the says who, and also answers the question why not, because you have to get past the human dignity question, and religion has an answer to human dignity that's harder to get around.
Okay, so I want to look at that. And one thing, I do think that, so the beginning of my response to that would be that I absolutely agree with this idea that when you look at it as a says who question, and then you get rid of religion, then it invites a different says who. And I think the most common one is actually says society. So the collective, society as a whole says it. And then, of course, the question becomes, well, who speaks for society? Who speaks for the collective? And, the answer ends up being, well, Comrade Stalin speaks for the collective, or Herr Hitler is the Führer. He's the world historical figure who will speak for the German nation. And so you have it being, says me, it becomes the dictates of a dictator. But the problem I see with it as proposing a transcendent, or a religion, by which you mean a religious answer to the says who question, is it still requires the same question of interpretation. Well, who says, the says who, if it says who is God, well, who says what God says, right? And so you can cite Hitler and Stalin and the contemporary horrors of that, but you can also look back to the Spanish Inquisition or various types. I found out that the sort of popular saying "kill them all, let God sort them out" actually has its basis in a Catholic bishop, I think, who was in charge of putting down a sect of heretics in southern France, and was told that there's some Orthodox believers among this group of heretics. He says, kill them all, God will recognize his own. So there has always been this basic ineradicable problem of some human being has to decide what the big truth is, or what the source of morality is, what morality dictates. And so it always creates the possibility for somebody to then say, my dictates are synonymous with God's will, and therefore create an oppressive or dictatorial system. Usually,
I can't agree with you any stronger than I do. I mean, that is an irrefutable argument as far as I'm concerned. The churches have done a miserable job, and are currently doing, I think, a really miserable job of accepting a limit on what they are permitted to do in order to vindicate their vision of the good. And I would not attempt to defend or excuse in any way. I've been doing a lot of reading lately, actually, on the problem of on this question of what exactly were the churches and the theologians up to in Nazi Germany, and the answer is not much, and most of it was terrible, and shocking. So religion doesn't, I think, provide any kind of guarantee of the execution of these values. I think that it frequently gets crossways with its own beliefs, and does stuff that I think is not consistent, like with Christianity. So but the
well, I think maybe what you're getting at there is that it's not so much a vindication of the institution, and maybe that's bad news for, there are some religious sects that are more committed to the idea that our institution, you have to believe in our institution, and our institution is eternal, and it has authority. And there are other sects that are a lot less committed to that and much more decentralized. So maybe that's bad news for the ones that are committed to the idea of the church as an authority. But here's what I want to go back to, which is that given that people can, go off, even if they have a religious basis, that's not really a guarantee, because they can go off the rails in very serious ways. Yeah. And so I think I like the idea of that the question of says who. I think the answer to that is says nobody, meaning that there's no one person, there's no one authority that says who. That I think our answer to says who in matters of morality should be the same as it is in matters of science, right? In science, is there a says who? Is there one institution that we go back to? Well, no, we have institutions where we all compare notes, and somebody makes an argument and they write a paper and they cite their evidence, and then you have to convince everybody else to go along. And basically, can we do the same thing in the field of morality and in the field of politics? And I think, to some extent, I mean, Jonathan Rauch wrote a book recently that I liked a lot called The Constitution of Liberty. Constitution of Liberty is Hayek. He was. I know the book you're talking about. The book, I think it's called The Constitution of Truth or something like that. It's basically applying this to the epistemological question. I keep calling it the Constitution of Liberty because it just comes right off the tongue. But a Constitution of Knowledge is the name of the book. Anyway, so the idea is, he says, we had this system we adopted where there is no authority that decides these things, and we created institutions that allow us to work together and reach consensus, and sometimes not reach consensus, but basically to be able to answer these questions for ourselves without a central authority. And so basically the question is, why could that not work for morality or for politics? Because in politics we have a system of voting. We have a literal constitution that is sort of partly designed to do that for us.
I think I would say that that's exactly how it's working, how you just described. I mean, particularly in an era in which religious attachments and affiliations are in decline, people are having, like I said, they're having to work harder because they can't rely on or receive knowledge that they don't believe in, and so they're having to kind of figure out and through the social trial and error process, right? That's what we're talking about. This is when you say that science doesn't have an authority, it has authoritative processes, right? There are things that you can and cannot do in science, and still have it be science, right? And I think that is that is very much replicated in sort of the way that social exchange kind of propagates values, right? There are things that we say you cannot do and remain part of a liberal society, or a human society, and it isn't liberal. You're gonna wind up as an outcast if you don't adhere to these core ideas. So I would say that's what you just described is exactly where we are.
And I want to set the context for that, which is that, part of the reason why this kind of discussion has come to the forefront is, I think, especially in the last 30 years, that there has been sort of a falling off. If you look at the graph of it, there's this tremendous falling off in terms of church attendance and in terms of people the now one of the largest groups is the nothing in particulars. So they're not necessarily, the number of people who are outright atheists like me have grown, but it's not just that, it's also the people who don't have any specific religious belief. They don't go to church. They are essentially secular. Even if they're not atheists, they are essentially secular, and that has become like larger than evangelicals and almost as large as the number of Catholics. So it's become one of the largest sort of, you might call, religious minorities or subgroups in America. And of course, Europe is ahead of us, on that. They're a number of decades ahead, where churches exist as a place to have pretty pictures taken at your wedding, but you don't actually go to it other than that. So I think that's the dilemma we're working on, is like, we have thousands of years of history of saying, well, what do we have as a grounding for morality? Well, we have the church, we have some kind of religion. Even before Christianity, the Romans, the Greeks had their own version, somewhat looser and more or less formed. They had their own version of a pagan religion. And we are entering, historically, ideologically, intellectually, very new territory here. And I think you're right that it is a lot more work, because you don't have a pre-existing thing where you just say, well, there's a book, go look it up. And it's in this book. Have somebody read to you stories from the book.
Yeah, it's in this book. It's in this corpus of teaching that your local parish propagates, and it's generation after generation. Like that is gone, or that mechanism no longer operates that way. So we are having to find new ways of propagating these values. And again, from a Smithian standpoint, there's a lot to work with there, right? We are bent toward a kind of social exchange that helps to build the moral capacity of human beings, right? I desire both to be loved, as Russ Roberts talks about. I desire to be loved and lovely. I desire to be known as somebody who's worthy of love, and so that nurturing mechanism for these values works extremely well. And I would argue, because I'm coming at it from from the standpoint of somebody who actually believes in God, that God built us this way. Like we are tuned to this. It's we can't exist without it. There's no such thing as a human mind on its own. It requires other human minds in order to thrive and grow and build and create. And so we are built this way. You don't have to agree with me on that. You do not have to agree with me that God laid this down in our DNA in order for us to cooperate with one another in trying to build the flourishing society that we all want.
Let
me just finish on this, this thought on this point, which is fundamentally, I'm not like, I recognize that I'm not speaking for anybody but myself here. However, my fundamental principle in all of this is non-coercion. Unless people willingly and of their own volition embrace religious teaching or religious belief, there is nothing that can be done to them from the outside to compel that belief. That view is not shared as broadly these days as I would like.
That is the old Lockean argument, though, right? That only was it light and persuasion, inner light and persuasion can change your mind, or there's Jonathan Mayhew, an early American preacher, said you can't coerce someone into being a good Christian any more than you coerce them into being a good mathematician, or a good a number of other examples like that.
Quote.
Yeah. So there is that sort of Lockean argument that conviction has to, by the very nature, has to come from within. It can't be from without. You can force somebody to mouth the right words or to go through the motions. You can't actually change what's inside of them. But so the the way I look at it is, so I differ a little bit. I think you sort of are presenting as the alternative to your argument is that the alternative would be sort of the evolutionary argument, right? We evolved this way, and this is the sort of Stephen Pinker evolutionary psychology kind of viewpoint, that we have a certain set of behaviors that are or urges or desires that are programmed into us evolutionarily because they helped us to survive, and then therefore we will tend to act on those, and then develop the rules that we develop as a society. I'm less convinced about that inner programming, but what I will say is I think every one of us is we come into existence in a family. I mean, we come into existence or in some kind of unit of people. You were born as an infant, knowing nothing. You come into existence in a group where you are in some way supported and cared for and fed and educated and socialized, and where you come to learn these rules of behavior. But then I also think you reach a state of adulthood where you're able to go and observe, and people have the history of the world is a history of reform movements, right, where somebody is acculturated into the way things are, and that says, well, wait a minute, why don't we change this one thing over here? And sometimes it's a bad idea, and oftentimes it's a good idea. So you have a Frederick Douglass, who's raised as a slave and told this is your position in society, and who doesn't accept it. So I think we also have the fact that we are able to observe and to make our own observations about this is the best way to live. So the issue I have with the religious argument is, and the way I usually get it from religious conservatives, they'll say something along the lines of, we have to have religion so we can have these moral rules, because if we don't have these moral rules, then everything will fall apart and we'll all be worse off. And my argument is, well, if without these rules, we'd all be worse off and everything would fall apart, why isn't that the reason that we adopt the rules? Why can't we just adopt the rules saying that, well, if we don't do this, society collapses and we are, we fall into a dictatorship, we fall into anarchy, we fall into chaos. The edifice of modern civilization that makes our lives better, it goes away. So that's sort of what I would put as the secular argument is, I think we can adopt these rules simply because it's not the old saying, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. How about it's not just the law, it's a good idea, right? We'll accept this because it's a good idea and not because it is a religious law handed down.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to go, it reminded me of something what you just talked about reminded me of something that you wanted to go back to, that I wanted to go back to, which is, again, this is like, it's like watching a street scene from opposite sides of the street. I won't say a car accident. Let's just say it's a street scene. And on one side of the street, it looks one way. And on another side of the street, it looks a very different way. And people will report very different things based on where they're standing. And so I think that, to me, the distinction between the sort of the religious side of the street and the secular side of the street is looking at the same things from different perspectives, and it's not two different things, it's the same thing, and that this evolutionary pathway that we've been talking about here is another way of arriving at the same place. What I would say, however, is to go back to what I said before. I don't really buy the consequentialist argument, like we have to do this, otherwise things fall apart. That's clearly not true. You can have a perfectly stable, peaceful, and in many ways a flourishing society without it, right? But one of the things that understanding can't answer is this question, like I said, who says and why not? Those questions. And every once in a while, you kind of need to have answers for those questions. And I would also just say, this is a line from C.S. Lewis where he talks about, we only know a crooked line because we have within us what a straight line is. I'm paraphrasing, but we have within us an idea of what a straight line is supposed to be. Now, that straight line, the things that we think of as the common corpus of human morality, which extends beyond any particular religious tradition, is found in most religious traditions. That seems to be a universal. Again, it can be the product of this evolutionary cycle that we're talking about, and the social exchange that creates it, or it could be something that's been given to us. I'm persuaded for myself that it's something that's given to us, and that we then develop. So it's not a. I don't have a. I don't have, because nobody has the kind of scientific evidence that they would need to prove that. And to me, it's not a scientific question.
So my thought on that, though, is that, well, first of all, my answer to C.S. Lewis is we know a straight line because straight lines exist in nature. We observe them in nature. There are many different ways.
There are almost no straight lines in nature.
Oh, the horizon at sea is as close as you get to a straight line visually.
But when you look around you in your room where you are right now, where do these straight lines come from? You know?
Well, my room. Yeah. By the way, before we began, I had to adjust the camera so that all the brick lines behind me weren't at an angle.
Straight lines aren't natural in nature for the most part. They are the nature around us is crooked. And in most of the beauty that we see in the natural world is a result of its irregularity, not its regularity.
I would disagree with that. I think there's lots of examples of regularity, but my point is that I think we can, if you ask what is a straight line, you would actually start by observing things in nature. So actually, the original way you would do this is, I don't know if you know how they leveled. How is it that they built the pyramids and they built them on a level spot? They would dig trenches, a network of trenches, and they fill them with water, and the water would all reach the same level, and that's how they would level the base of the giant pyramid.
The ground was uneven to start with.
Right, but my point is, though, that you are able to observe what a straight line is by observing it in nature, and then coming up with new methods and techniques, and basically, all of science is a matter of basically making observations from nature and then arriving at broader conclusions and more advanced techniques. What I will grant to you is this, which is, I think the humanities have not caught up with science, that that morality has not caught up with the science. Now, I'm not saying that it should be arrived at by the same methodology of science. You wouldn't use statistics necessarily. You wouldn't, use exactly the same techniques you would use in science, but more the idea of using observation to draw conclusions and to arrive at general principles. I think that we are underdeveloped on that still. And I think that's how you got this idea that, when religion fades and we become more secular, that there is this, these other things that took over and became monstrous, like communism. Communism was supposed to be a scientific answer to arranging human affairs and arranging human societies. And of course, you and I know, those of us who studied the economics of this know it's anything but scientific. It's a pseudoscience, right? It's like you're arranging your society around astrology, possibly worse than that. So, but I think that, when we tried to do something that was to replace religion with a rational outlook, that various pseudosciences like that popped up, and then that created the problem of creating, monstrous societies.
Yeah.
I would say
much the same thing in Nazi Germany. And I would say, when you look at communism, that was really thought of, I think, of as a sort of Christian social ethics minus Christianity.
Yes,
right?
very much so. I mean, I think it goes back to Comte, who had this religion of humanity, where he was basically taking the Christian, a very extreme version of Christian ethics, and basically saying we're going to derive this scientifically, and create this whole scientific system. It turned out to be, of course, a pseudoscientific system behind it. But here's what I think you said something earlier that I liked, which is it takes a lot of work to do this on a secular foundation. Now, I think, on the one hand, I think that the reason we're facing it is because we have become a more sophisticated, more universally educated society. If you're talking about, peasants in the Middle Ages who learned religion by looking at the carvings on the side of the cathedral, you had people who didn't have the time, they didn't have the leisure, they didn't have the education to figure out all these questions for themselves very easily. Whereas I think that the thing that creates the problem, the increased secularism, comes from the advance and the broadening of education and literacy and knowledge of history, et cetera. And so that almost like the thing that creates the greater secularization is also the answer to the problem created by secularization, which is people have a much greater wherewithal to be able to spend time and have the resources and have information to be able to think about these moral questions independently for themselves. However, again, it is hard work, and there's lots of ways for it to go wrong, and for new sort of. I mean, I think there's a good argument that current wokeness, for example, some of the excesses of today's left are an attempt to fill the gap left by religion. And there's this whole trend recently of politics filling the gap in terms of people's personal identity and their affinities, that you no longer say, oh, I'm a Catholic, you're a Protestant. You say, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, or, I'm a pro-Trump guy, or you're a Obama or a Biden voter.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. Although I think that the case as a case study of this has some elements that really cut against the idea that education brings you to a better place, or a place where you don't need religion in order to find answers to identity and purpose and things like that, because it was the most educated and most advanced society in Europe that had and has a voracious appetite for learning. But that learning, without, this is my reading, obviously, but with the loss of the transcendent, actually, it's not that people just stop believing in God. It's that they started believing in all sorts of crazy things that I think point to something that we haven't talked about yet, but whether human beings have a natural need for spirituality, and for that they have this God-shaped hole in them that has to be filled by something. And what we can see in these totalitarian movements is that the demands of the transcendent don't go away. That human beings continue to have this need for a deeper anchoring for their lives. And so if they don't have good stuff to put in there, then all sorts of bad stuff can flood in. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in the American church today, actually, in which the loss of what I would regard as normative, orthodox Christian belief has sort of bled out of the system and is now being filled with all sorts of nonsense, including QAnon and flat earth theory and things that give people a sense of an attachment to the idea of a transcendent that is beyond their own experience. So I'm not sure that education, I don't think this is necessarily an education issue or an intelligence issue, the way it gets framed. I think that it goes to these deeper instincts that that human beings have for wanting an explanation, essentially, for the world that they see around them.
Well, describing it as an explanation for the world you see around you, I think is a good way of doing this. I agree that there is a spiritual need in that sense. I wouldn't call it transcendent because I don't think it transcends the world that we live in. But I do think, we are complex intellectual creatures. We have these very the whole thing that shapes human life is we have these big brains and this ability to be, form these very complex conclusions and complex abstractions. And so that gives rise to a whole set of psychological and epistemological needs of trying to, as you put it, understand the world around us and know that we know what we're doing, and know that we know what we're doing, not just, right at the current moment. A cow doesn't need this. A cow says, look, there's grass, I'm going to go munch on it, right? And it'll fill my tummy and then I'll get milked. And that's, a cow's life is very simple. A human's life is not simple. We need to know, what am I going to do as my career for the next 40 years of my life? And those are extremely complex, because we're so specialized, because we're so advanced, because we're so intellectual, we face these series of extremely complex questions about what is required in our life, what is the nature of the world around us, what should we be doing, how do we make decisions, we need to, how do we know that what we know is true? We face these very complex questions. So I think you're right, we absolutely need that spiritual, what you call spiritual aspect of life, that I would describe it as a higher intellectual level of sort of a consciousness of yourself and of the world and of a worldview that will tie it all together. I just think that you can arrive at that through secular means by observing the world and making big conclusions. But you made a good point. It's a lot of work, and oftentimes people do a bad job of it. And historically, often they have done a bad job of it. That without religion, they come up with.
And they did a bad job. They did a bad job. We always do a bad job with it.
Right? Yeah, I mean, even with religion, we've often done a bad job.
Even with religion, we did a really bad job with this. This is part of the epistemic crisis of being a human being. As you point out, our minds are large. They are, quite frankly, the largest thing that we can imagine, because we become aware of our own complexity, and we are overwhelmed by all of the parts of ourselves that we don't really understand. Like there are always aspects of our behavior and our attitudes and our actions and the whole concept of just like loving another person. Like, what is that? We are locked in an epistemic crisis. That's what it means to be human. And we have to have answers. We have to have solutions, or at least partial solutions or tentative solutions, in order to get out of bed in the morning. And so religion has played that role for me, for many people I know. It doesn't work for everybody. It isn't satisfactory. People have to find their own way and their own path in confronting that crisis, but the crisis will always have to be confronted.
Yeah, and so I think you talked to earlier, and I thought it was an interesting analogy of two people viewing the same events from different sides of the street. And so things tend to look like they're going one way for one person, they look like they're going the other way for the other person. And I think that's a little bit of our difference of outlook here. But one thing, in terms of what actually makes a difference from that, the one thing I'm most concerned about in this is the sort of the nationalist conservative argument, which is that if religion is so necessary for morality in an orderly society, then we have to have government come and support it and promote it. And usually it means support and promote my particular version of religion. And that's where you get the sort of burning, I think we could both agree, it's sort of the burning down the village in order to save it kind of argument, where, we have to have religion to support a free society. And so to do that, we're going to violate freedom in order to promote religion.
When I hear like the comment, or what's the name of that magazine? It's a comment magazine. I can't remember. Compact. That's right.
Yeah.
We hear the contributors to that organ talking. I always want to ask them, did you always believe what you believe right now? The answer is no.
Right.
They didn't always believe what they believe right now. Did you arrive at that? Did you arrive at your current conclusions on the basis of freedom of inquiry, or did you arrive at it on the basis of somebody telling you that you had to believe this, right? And the answer, of course, is no, I reached this as a free conclusion. Well, then why would you not extend that same opportunity to other people, rather than trying to set up instruments of state power that are going to try to drive people toward those conclusions? I think that is absurd. I think it's dangerous. I think it is damaging. I think it is, I can't think of enough bad things to say.
Well, and I think more to the point, or perhaps more practically, it's also self-defeating, because I don't think they can create a political system that's going to promote their political views.
I wouldn't care if it worked. Honestly, I wouldn't care if it worked. I'd still be against it.
No, what I'm saying is that I don't think they can create a system that will promote their political views. I think they can tear down the guardrails and the defense of freedom of speech that would then allow somebody with a different viewpoint to impose it on us.
I firmly believe that they want to, at least some of them want to impose a vision of the good on everyone, right? Like, this has got to be for everybody, and I'm willing to use the power of the state in order to achieve it. And that's no thank you.
Okay. So I think it's been a great conversation. I think it's a nice continuation of what we did on what we started on Twitter, but that 288 characters at a time doesn't really allow you to get into the issue the way we would like. But I think
Elon's fixed that, though, hasn't he? Hasn't he now said that you can write 5,000 words in a Twitter post or something? Anyway,
yeah, but then it's just Blogger then. But for those who remember Blogger, the old blogging platform. Anyway, but I think that the thing that sets the context for this is, I think we are in the midst of a sort of great experiment with how do we have a secular society, and what will be the basis for that, what will provide the grounding and the spirituality and the moral foundation for that. So we are going to see this work out in real time over the coming decades.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, thanks so much for coming and having this conversation. I think that's been a good way to appreciate the different perspectives that we have.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Thanks for reaching out. I really appreciate it.
I'm Rob Tracinski. This is Symposium. My guest today has been Brent Orrell, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, you'll find more discussion about the ideas of the basis of a free society at symposium.substack.com. Please also like this on YouTube or subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And thank you for joining the conversation.